This week on the Death of the Reader Extended Cut, hear more about the sleeper hits in the 3 taps, learn about the life cycles of Tasmanian glowworms, and how do we rate the difficulty of the 3 taps. Stick around.
You're listening to 2SCR on 107.3. This is Flex and Herds bringing you Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour. We're on the 3rd and final episode, talking about 3 taps by Ronald Knox. The killer's been revealed, and we're going to talk about them.
Oh, I think you mean, Herds, we're going to talk about how right I was. Oh, boy.
I mean, you're not wrong.
I wasn't wrong. I was not wrong in the slightest.
You were pretty on the money, which is, maybe we'll see how you do in the future, but that's right. You get 1 victory up on this, you get 1 point.
Yep. We're keeping score, are we?
I guess
one
so.
To me, one to me.
You get 1 flex buck.
I will say, though, I do have to concede, I wasn't a big fan of Pulteney for a lot of the story.
What?
But, oh my goodness, did he carry it through to the finish line.
He is actually my favorite character, except maybe Angela. I mean, jury's still out on that one.
Yeah, it's definitely a close call on best performance between Angela and Pulteney, but Pulteney in the final section, which we're talking about today, which is from chapters 18 to the end.
Yeah.
My goodness, what a show.
Yeah, he doesn't just he proves himself to be instrumental to the solving of the mystery, but also is just a really enthusiastic guy. I kind of love him.
Yeah, it was very interesting because we had this whole kind of like anti-American undertone to a lot of the story, and then it ends up with Pulteney being one of the best characters in the story as the American.
Yeah.
So I think there's maybe even a bit of a deconstruction of relationships between the nations going on there.
I guess so. I don't know if I go that deep into it, but he certainly delivers himself well to the like absurdist comedy that's going on. Like, he's just so excited to be there and to solve crimes. And he even has a little bit where he talks about, man, if only I'd known that I was being suspected.
Why, to tell the truth, I've been shadowing Mr. Pulteney. I must apologize, Mr. Pulteney, but I felt bound to be careful. I've had you under close observation all this week, and it was only as I stood behind the door, watching your investigations into that car, that I became perfectly convinced of your innocence.
What? More suspicion? This is indeed a day. Why, if I had had the least conception that you were watching me, Mr. Leyland, I would have led you a red dance. My movements, I promise you, should have been full of mystery. I should have gone out every night with a scowl and a dark lantern. I am overwhelmed.
It's one of the best moments in the whole book where he's just like, what do you mean? I could have been playing this up so much more.
Yeah. I could have had so much more fun with this little game of ours, he says, as he puts away his fishing hook. His plans, laid to ruin, which I should say, I'm going to formally apologize to Pulteney for trying to put him in the role of the killer, because clearly he's just a stand-up guy trying to get a bit of fishing done.
I mean, I feel like he would have enjoyed knowing that you suspected him that much, right?
He would have.
Of course, you should have told him is the problem.
This is the thing. Unfortunately, we don't quite have the technology to be able to tell someone in a murder mystery when you suspect them. We're getting there, though. That's like the next evolution.
It is. Now, the one thing that I really wanted to talk about coming into today, because this is the end, right? We've reached the solutions.
If anything's unsaid today, it's just not worth talking about.
Dubious at best, but the way that the solutions are laid out is super, super fantastic in this story. It was such an emotional roller coaster going from Leyland's to Mottram's to Bredon's, where I was like, oh, I was so wrong. Oh, I was even more wrong too. Oh my God, I was completely right.
Yeah, this structure, the way that they lay out, like the catching of the killer or, not catching as the case turns out to be, and then the 3 different solutions that the novel presents, I think that's really cool. I don't think I've read a murder mystery that does anything quite like that. And getting that big hurrah at the end of, actually, I have solved it all by myself. I figured it out. It was all because one of my patience cards flew underneath the building.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a moment where I was like, maybe some of the audience would feel a bit cheated by this. The whole roller coaster of the varying solutions between the different detectives and Mottram himself, especially once we got to Mottram's, because you'd assume that Mottram would know what was going on, especially when he concluded that he was going to die.
Yeah, except that he totally didn't.
He totally did not.
That's the fun part, isn't it? That's why that's why we have our story without a moral, because, Mottram had this whole thing set up. He was going to fake a suicide to test the bishop, and then he died anyway.
Yeah, I was really happy that it did come down to that whole exploration of their morals. It was something that was brought up in the middle section, talking about, the consequentialist ends justify the means, versus the deontological, means should be the be all and end all. And I really like that the way the story introduced that and then actually continued to use it as a theme right up to the end.
For sure.
Where it was a test of the bishop's morals.
Yeah, although the bishop wasn't really on screen for very much of the book, so there's maybe a bit of question there of whether he really was tested, I suppose, but
I think one of the things with a story like a murder mystery where you're meant to be kind of engaged with what's going on in the puzzle, that's totally okay because then in that circumstance, the person being challenged is you.
I suppose so.
Like, there's a lot of stories you could read over it and go like, oh yeah, that's the moral lesson they're trying to teach. But because they're trying to get you to engage and solve the puzzle, you become the one who those questions are asked to.
For sure, for sure.
I think the other thing that was particularly fun seeing played out towards the latter section of the book was the relationship between the barmaid and Simmons.
I love that. That was my favorite part. Look, not favorite characters, but one of my favorite things was that the solution to, what's happening with the cigarette brand? Why is that just always there? Who is listening in on all our conversations? It was the servants. The servants are listening at the keyhole. And they even have a little joke at the end when they talk about, well, what do we do with the barmaid now? Well, I guess you'll probably get a lot of money from selling all of Mottram stuff. And then we hear the squeak at the door and the running away of the barmaid.
Yeah, it was one of those themes that they kind of introduced way back at the start of the maids listening to the doors.
Yeah.
And you were like, oh man, this is super suspicious. What's going on? What's going on? And they paid it off in a way that still was connected to the crime, was still a part of the story, but was a very effectively played out red herring, which I really loved.
I really love it, especially because, and this is something that I love in all murder mysteries that have false evidence or red herrings with, characters who appear suspicious but aren't, that sort of thing. I like that the motivation for that whole complication with the barmaid was because she loved Simmons so much and she wanted to have a relationship with him and she wanted that to be a good thing. It wasn't that she was, secretly stealing money under the table or something. It was just a really wholesome kind of B-plot almost. I feel like if you went and read through the novel again, you'd get this really tragic tale of a woman trying to save her relationship.
Yeah. I think also in the context of a story without a moral, it would feel very out of place if suddenly there was this evil undertone to the barmaid, stealing money or something.
She was the real culprit the whole time.
But I do enjoy when there's a red herring that kind of leads to a satisfying conclusion rather than just being dropped.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely one of the easiest ways to make your readers feel cheated in the murder mystery sense.
Sure. And I think that especially in the way that I enjoy, most novels, especially, murder fiction, I like when there's that element of humanity to it. I really like when we have these characters we can relate to. They're not just, the killer and the accomplice. They're real people, and it's their mistakes and it's their wants and desires that kind of get in the way of the mystery.
As we addressed earlier on, one of the things with detectives is that as they kind of got further into their own series, it became less of a human thing and more just a how big of a puzzle can I solve? And, obviously this is still the start of Breden's series, but having that human element is definitely one of the things that will kind of make or break detective fiction for me.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely the relatability of the detective and the characters within it is what's really going to drive your story forward, rather than just, playing a game of chess or patience.
Yeah, as we said earlier on, you will often describe a game of chess based on the people you play with rather than anything else.
For sure. It's that action that we really want to focus in on between the characters. And something else that kind of springs to mind, there's a bit of a strange scene when the characters they're trying to chase Boltney down. They end up in the gorge, and Brinkman, he kind of breaks out into a full run. There's this almost action-like sequence.
I really would love to see the film version of that because, a lot of murder mystery stories, it's very controlled, very calm camera movements as we follow the detective. But, when we get to those moments where suddenly there's an action break, you just want Paul Greengrass from the Bourne series just in there with his shaky cam and big punches.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine the moment when Brinky jumps up to grab the envelope and the lightning strikes and there's the strings playing in the background.
It was so over the top. It'd be amazing.
Yeah. It'd be an amazing moment. Da 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 da.
Yeah. And the other thing I really liked about that is, again, that was another example of something that could have felt really out of place but was very neatly executed. We kind of built up this big tension of suspicion for so long, and then that was our payoff for it.
Yeah.
And I think that scene kind of carried that momentum really well and stuck the landing, because that's a big problem with building tension. You got to stick the landing.
For sure. Yeah. Well, it was a really great moment for me reading through when I read through the first time. And I don't remember who it is, but the man in charge of the garage is like, I hope you don't mind, but during your investigation, I just need to take the car out about 20 minutes before you're expecting that your suspect will show up at the garage. I'm going to meet a man. I won't tell you what his name is or what the purpose is. I'm just going to go meet him at the station. Don't worry about it.
And they're like, yeah, go for it.
That's fine. We don't expect that Brinkman will be that person. He's coming to the garage, right? Despite the fact he knows he's being followed. It's great. It was a great moment to kind of have that revelation of, they're going to get in trouble there. But it was really good, though. I didn't feel like it was cheated. And in the end, we kind of hope that Brinkman gets away.
Yeah.
He was just an honest man, just trying to fake a suicide.
And, well, I mean, that's an interesting career title, right?
Isn't it?
Official suicide.
The sister, yeah.
Oh, goodness. Now, one of the other fun things was we had these 3 chapters right before the ending where it was, how Leland spent the evening, how Braden spent the evening, and how Eames spent the evening.
Yes.
Eames is one of these sleeper hit characters in this story who just kind of like showed up, slightly later in the story. He's super nice to Braden, helps him out, gives him a bunch of information. He's kind of one of the linchpins for solving the mystery, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Especially when we get down to those conversations about morality. And I really love that we get this different perspective chapter where we're following Eames.
It was great.
The kind of sense of uncertainty and also the much more pressing tension. It's not like an incredible high-intensity scene, but I think that kind of throwing us for a loop by putting us in another character's headspace was a really good way to explore where we were in the story at that point.
No, for sure.
If you hadn't been engaged with the mystery, that was kind of like the reset point where it was like, here's everything you should be on top of. And of course, it ended with a fantastic quote from Pulteney.
Mr. Pulteney, do you mind going to the stables at the back of the inn to find my man who's waiting there? Tell him what's happened, say he's to get on the telephone, break into the post office if necessary, and warn Pulford and Logill. He may just have time to head the man off. Oh, by the way, he won't know who you are. He may take you for Brinkman. Say, here we are again, loudly, do you mind, when you're outside the stable?
It will be a novel experience.
I think that this was kind of really the moment. Like, Pulteney had obviously been getting better and better up to this moment, but this was the time I was like, here we go.
This is his moment to shine. And I think that, like, this is really the thing that really holds this novel together, is that the detective has a much less presence than most detective fiction, but this ensemble cast. And it's the first novel, right? This is the first novel that Knox has written with Braden and with these other supporting characters, but he really brings it together in a really great way.
He really brings it together?
He brings it together. I'm just disappointed I didn't think of that. He really Pulteneys it together. Yeah! Anyway. Yeah.
It kind of will be unfortunate, if anything, going to the next Miles Braden novel and not having this rich cast.
Well,
you really hope that he can construct a similar strong plethora of characters.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? That we'll have to check out if we check out the next book or the next couple books. Like, which characters will make an occurrence, which characters get cameos, that sort of thing. Yeah, I think that the way that he's structured this group, I could see Pulteney coming back and saying, hey, it's so crazy. You went to Brazil to solve a murder mystery. Well, I came here for vacation to go fishing,
Just the whole cast rocks up just completely out of context. That'd be fantastic.
And they're all wearing Hawaiian t-shirts, and that's it. That's all that I want.
That's the kind of story I would love to have.
Would be perfect.
Pultneft. Nah, it doesn't work. All right, up next on Death of the Reader, we have Krissy Kneen, who is in town for the Sydney Writers' Festival, to talk a little bit about villainous forces and how to make them say more than what's just on the page. You're listening to Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour, brought to you by 2SER 107.3. We are Flex and Herds, your hosts. Joining us today, we have respected author Krissy Kneen, panelist on the Sydney Writers' Festival and writer of Wintering, about the spooky monster-filled wilds of Tasmania, to talk about making monsters. How are you today, Krissy?
I'm good. How are you?
Going very well. I've got Herds here with me.
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
We're very polite for people talking about monsters.
Yeah.
That's the fun of it, isn't it? If you can't sit down and have a cup of tea with your monsters, then what are you doing, really?
Exactly. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was wintering. You know, we understand there's a little bit of mystery involved, which of course is our ballpark. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, wintering's a mystery about a woman who's living in the deep south of Tasmania. She's not a local. She's there doing her PhD. And then one day her long-term partner, who is a local, disappears, and she has no idea what's happened to him. His car is found on a very remote road. The door opens and nothing, is heard from him. And it's, the kind of environment where in midwinter you don't want to be stuck outside for very long. And as she tries to figure out what happened to him, she discovers that she didn't know everything about him in the first place. She'd been living with him for 8 years, but had no idea that he had a whole lot of other things going on in his life.
Yeah, so the antagonistic force this novel is kind of the mystery of, what's happened to her partner. Is it the monster in the woods? Is that kind of thing that's pressing down?
There's a layer of the idea that it is something monstrous that has either taken him or that maybe he has become. Yeah. And there's a group of, when she kind of is searching for him in Tasmania, there's a group of women, a lot of them older women, who have gathered together. They've all lost their partners and their husbands in a similar way, mysterious way, and they all believe that they were taken by the tiger. Right. And they believe that there's a kind of a were tiger from the Tasmanian tigers that are left that kind of have taken them and changed their partners into, a monstrous being. And this, our heroine Jessica is a woman of science. She's doing her PhD in biology and glowworm study, and so she really doesn't want to kind of go on the journey that these women have gone on to believe that the answer to the mystery is that they've been taken by a monster. But she also half believes, because she comes from a very, very strongly religious background. She was brought up in a cult in Queensland and escaped that to become a woman of science. So she's kind of torn between the idea that the monstrous and the mysterious are things that are all around us, and that's the idea that she's been running away from all her life.
Yeah,
so these women challenge it.
It sounds like a lot to unpack. So I guess my question is, how do you decide how much information to kind of feed the readers as they go along? Because obviously you start off with this, this core mystery of the were tigers and lost partners. How do you decide how kind of consistently and how quickly to feed that information to your reader? What's that process like?
Oh, that's the hardest bit of this book. It's actually the balance between the magic and the science. It was the hardest thing to kind of get right in this book, and how to kind of, how to drip feed information to keep the reader wanting to turn the page and wanting to read on, but also without turning off a reader who likes the mystery in life. So, the readers of horror genre, but also without turning off the readers who don't like to read about the mysteries in life, who like to everything to be boxed neatly into kind of scientific packages. So I wanted to play this line where depending on what type of a reader you are telling a different story to yourself in your head. So the idea that it starts very much rooted in reality, and in the idea that this woman is just missing her partner, and she's going on a bit of a hunt to ask locals if they know anything about him and this secret life she discovers. And then this kind of the elements of mystery are sort of fed in by this group of women, which she calls the coven of women. So the coven kind of feed these ideas, and that happens sort of slowly as the book emerges.
So when you sit down and write antagonists like this, they're kind of compelling and underhanded and not really as out in the open as the, face value of the story is. How do you keep those characters compelling, and kind of what's your process for building those villains while they're more or less behind the scenes?
it has to hook me in. I think that really my process is a little bit haphazard in that I have to want to learn about them as a writer, and so for me it's about keeping the story going for me in my head. So I was never really exactly sure where this was going to end as I was writing. And, if I got bored of a particular line of inquiry, then the audience is definitely going to get bored. So for me, it was about keeping the ideas alive in my head, making sure that there was the possibility that my antagonist could be, a good guy at any point. He might turn out to be not such a beast as we're kind of led to believe. So that kind of the balance, between making him scary but also keeping the idea that maybe he's not so scary alive was the trick that I was playing with my own head, I suppose. So yeah, it was quite. I'm not one of those people who sits down and makes spreadsheets and charts and tries to make everything scientific, I suppose. I'm not one of those people who likes to kind of block everything out before I start. And I really have so much respect for writers who do that. But for me, I've got a very short attention span, and so I need to be engaged. I need to sit down every day at my desk and not know exactly where the book is going to go. It needs to engage me. So that's my process, really.
Yeah, that's always such a fascinating topic when it comes to mystery in particular, the idea of whether the author discovered it along with the audience, more or less, or whether they planned it out all ahead. And I think that there's definitely a brilliant organic nature that comes from the author discovering what they're writing as they do so.
Yeah, it's actually it's the only way that I can work is that kind of organic way. I've tried to plot things out, and I just get too bored, and it feels too prescriptive when I'm writing it. It feels like I'm just colouring by numbers. So for me, I have to challenge myself and surprise myself. And with this book in particular, it was kind of flip-flopping right until the very final edit. I kept going back and just teasing out that balance between the supernatural and the scientific, and it changed, right up until the very day I delivered it. So it was a really interesting process to kind of make sure that I had both those elements evenly balanced, and I didn't want a reader to kind of feel like I'd come in prescribing the way they needed to read this book. I wanted the reader to be very, very active in the rolling out of the story, and I wanted the book to be a different book depending on who you were as a reader, so that it actually looks different depending on your background and your belief system.
Yeah, you mentioned that science and respecting the rules of science and nature were really important for this novel. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Because my character is a scientist, I really wanted to get. I wanted to get the science right of what she was researching, and so I basically borrowed research that was already happening into glowworms and whether they sleep or not. So the circadian rhythms of glowworms. And down there in the south of Tasmania, there are unique colonies of glowworms that only exist in that area. And there are scientists who've been doing research on whether they sleep, whether they have inactive periods and active periods. And I thought that was fascinating. So I kind of went down that route quite heavily. I wanted to make sure that all of the science in the book was completely, cutting edge, up to date, and very correct. So that when I put elements of mystery into the book, there was a strong hook to balance it back in reality and to ground it in reality as well. So if you kind of look at the science, it's right. The science that she's doing is correct. It is the science that's going on at the moment, and it is being done in the way that you would do it. And so her world is very grounded in that scientific community. But when you look at the women who have formed that coven of women, they really don't care about the science. They only care about the ideas and the mysteries and the fears that they have. And so for me, it was about balancing those two worlds very clearly.
Presumably, if you're looking at the actual science that's taking place in the real world, you would have had a couple of characters kind of come to reflect the people that you interacted with in making, that journey of discovery into that scientific information. Would you say that those influences are particularly prevalent in The Wintering?
Not so prevalent, because what I did was I stole the information before I actually realised I was going to publish this book. This book was a bit of a side project for me. I was writing something else, and this book kind of came because I was living in the south of Tasmania, and the landscape kept knocking at my head. And so, finding the research that these people were doing was really a matter of Googling at the time. And I thought, oh, look, I'll change all that later. But, of course, it became very much a part of the book. So when it turned out that this was a book and it was going to get published, I had to kind of backward engineer the whole thing, and I had to go and find the scientists who'd done the research and just check that I'd done everything right and make sure that that they were okay, that I was using their work in the book. And so then they were really lovely and really happy to give me some more pointers and that sort of thing. But it was really at the end of the process that I sort of scrambled to kind of make sure that I had permissions, because I'd fully intended to change it to something else, when the time came.
Yeah, and this novel has a strong focus on, life partners going missing, and there's this coven of witches, it sounds like, that exists, sort of forming a community out in the forest, if I'm understanding correctly. How important is it, or I guess, how central to the novel are these relationships, and really laying out these relationships and making them feel like they're real and they existed?
That's really important to me. Like I wanted, in a way, I was in that landscape and in that environment, and I was also seeing some of the local people who were incredibly capable. There was a woman living right down in the southernmost part of Tasmania who was still fishing in her 90s. And, I was putting out the boat with my dad down there while I was down there, and it's pretty full-on work to put the boat out and take, the nets out, haul the nets back in. It's actually really strenuous. And when I heard about this woman who was, had been living there all her life without power, without town water, just a generator and, tanks, and here she is in her 90s still fishing and feeding herself, it gave me a real sense of what I was lacking and what the city people were kind of lacking compared to the local people. And it gave me this sense of the different strengths that the different women had. So and I wanted to kind of look at that relationship between a woman who has all this kind of intellectual strength. She has her strength. She's also, my main character, Jessica, is also, she grew up in this strange environment, so she learned how to shoot a gun in the cult that she grew up in. And she learned how to do some very basic things. But, when she kind of encounters these women who've been living on the land and off the land for so long, she kind of sees that this could be a future for herself too. So I really wanted to show that the relationships between her and the other women in the town particularly, and also her relationships to the other men in town, because, there are some guys who just are not particularly woke, I suppose, in that area, and not particular feminists in that area, and who treat her in a particular way. But there are also others in the community who are incredibly generous and lovely and understanding and treat her just like another human being. So those relationships, I really wanted to make sure that they were real and true, and living in that place and actually interacting with the people around me gave me, I suppose, the palette for all those characters.
So I suppose I wanted to ask, you are part of the Making Monsters panel. I wanted to know if you have one piece of advice or observation maybe when it comes to making a villain relevant and compelling, and not just a mustache-twirling schemer.
Yeah, well, I think that, firstly, I think that the thing that the one piece of advice is that it's all a metaphor. That, I think horror is always a metaphor for something in the real world. So if you think about that, and you think about what a particular kind of monster, what kind of fear does that monster evoke, it's always a metaphor for something in your real life that you can be afraid of. So in this book, the metaphor is the monstrousness within a man who keeps a woman in a domestic violence situation. So domestic violence is a very big theme in this book, but it's also a metaphor for that idea of the tiger and the violence that can be, that kind of mystical violence that can happen with the monster. So I think just keep in your head, it can be a metaphor, even if you have a monster that is a real life, fanged beast. What is that a metaphor for? What is the fear of that? And how does that translate into the real world? That's my advice.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Krissy. It was lovely to speak to you.
That was so much fun. Thank you very much.
You're listening to Death of the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour on 2SER 107.3. I'm Flex.
I'm Hertz.
And that was Krissy Kneen teaching us how a good monster is made. Check out her novel The Wintering for a spooky good time. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER 107.3, your Murder Mystery World Tour. Thank you to the Meter family for our lovely theme music. We haven't shouted them out yet, but they kindly provided that to us, and it's absolutely wonderful. Right now on Death of the Reader is normally when we discuss what we think is going to happen, what we think the solution to the puzzle is. Normally one of us is blind, normally the other can see all. But this time, we both see all because we've reached the end of the 3 taps.
It's true. It's kind of sad, really. As much as I enjoyed our back and forth. Me arguing for the old man with the fishing hooks. You arguing for the man with the keys and the money and the motivation and everything that made sense.
Everything that made sense. I do have to ask you, Herds, did you feel at any point like you were going to be able to misdirect me, or did you reckon I got it?
Oh, I mean, I've known you long enough to know that you're a pretty sharp eye for these sorts of things.
Alrighty.
There was definitely a chance, mainly to do with, Pulteney pointing things out. That's one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading it. How, like, he keeps saying, oh, this clue, like, there's the flies for fishing, but they're not the right ones. Like, he's the person who is always pointing out clues. So he could very easily be, misdirecting the reader. But clearly he's just being a little bit of his own.
I think the thing that was very interesting to me about that scene in particular was that when he points out the flies for fishing, it's also mentioned that, like, every man in his heart believes he could be a good detective.
Yeah.
And even though I know that not to be true, I still just have to try my best.
But he is.
And, obviously that could have been him as the culprit being like, well, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Elbows in the side and all.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out, and I kind of suspected at that moment that was the truth, that he was just so fascinated by it. Because he'd been trying to guess everything that happened the whole way along, whereas Brinkman spent a lot more time, saying things about Mottram's character and the way that the setup itself actually was.
Yeah. Well, that's why when I was pitching the second episode, when I was trying to, like, misdirect you, I said, oh, well, maybe Brinkman is trying to catch Pulteney, but it was the other way around, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of one of the definite strong suits of this story, is that our main 2 suspects are both kind of going after each other in one way or another.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Brinkman is really going after Pulteney in any way, but you could construe that argument.
I don't think what Brinkman was doing was intentional, which, if anything, is kind of a hint towards the motivations of his character, right?
Sure.
Is that he was trying to dissuade suspicion from himself, and the only other logical target was Pulteney.
I suppose so.
So in the same way where this whole problem was accidentally dropped on Brinkman's head, he keeps, accidentally pushing this onto Pulteney in terms of suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those kind of parallels that I think made this puzzle very fair. The way that even the kind of logical correlations between certain character aspects reflected how you could read the final solution.
Sure.
Like, especially when we got to the first meeting of the bishop, and the bishop saying that, like, half jokingly he was saying that he was going to donate all of his money to the church. And, sometimes when you say things half jokingly, it's to gauge someone's reaction, right?
For sure.
And that ended up being what Mottram's motivation was.
He had this whole big test that he was trying to put the bishop through, even though it didn't quite go according to plan. It still ended up testing him in the end anyway. Yeah,
so I do think that if we were to say, is this a fair story? 100% stamp of approval.
Sure. I would contest a couple points. I would contest there are a couple of things where the clues are not quite as laid out as they should be, particularly when it comes to the 3 taps themselves. We know that the taps are important because it's the name of the novel. We know that the gas killed Mottram. But the description of the tabs and how they're laid out is not, I don't know if it's just that it's not laid out well or it's just incredibly boring to read, but it did not occur to me for a second that you could, for example, turn off a tap without leaving a fingerprint because it was just, it's just whatever. We don't care about leaving fingerprints on taps in a murder mystery, because that's a big part of that mystery is, how did the tap get turned off? If there are no fingerprints, there just weren't any fingerprints is the answer, which is very silly.
I don't necessarily disagree.
Thank you.
There definitely were moments earlier on where those things were presented. I will completely agree that the description of the taps themselves is just like...
Yeah, sure.
But when we actually get to how to use them in the puzzle, there's definitely presentation of the fact that, this tap is looser than the other.
Sure.
So this one would be easy to, turn on without leaving fingerprints. This one would be very difficult. Then especially when it's the difficult one that has a print on one side, we have the whole thing where he got the handkerchief and pulled it back the other way.
Sure.
Which, because it's been turned off, that's obviously has to have factored in somehow. The thing I will say above all else, though, is I completely agree the taps were overly convoluted, but I also think that that's entirely the point because it lends credibility to the accident.
I suppose so. I just don't like it. I don't think it's a particularly clean kind of puzzle. It's fine. The puzzle makes sense and the way it's explained. They even put a little diagram in there, but I just don't feel like the way that it actually works is clear enough for most people to figure that out. All of the other points about, whether it's a suicide or a murder, that is presented very clearly through the arguments of both Leyland and Breton. But the way that the tap works, we don't have an engineer on site. In my mind, it's kind of similar to the way that the doctor's examination is presented.
Yeah.
Because if we have a doctor say, here is the corpse, I see nothing wrong with the corpse except that it was killed by gas. We should take that as fact, and that's easy to understand. That's a piece of evidence. But the taps are a bit more complicated, and we don't have someone to say, this is the relevant information. The doctor says, they were killed by gas. That's all we need to know. But we didn't have someone to say, this is the piece of information about the taps that is important. This is what you need to jot down on your little piece of paper. You can visualize the taps, but it's not clear what piece of information is relevant, I suppose. It's fine to be there. It's fine to be part of, the murder weapon. But when I'm looking for a murder weapon, I'm not looking for a dart that shoots through the vent and it's, activated by a hair trigger.
You're not looking through a fishing hook through a window from a two-story ladder?
As much fun as that is to imagine, I'm not looking for a trap X. And that's one of Knox's commandments.
It is indeed.
No hitherto undiscovered poisons may be used, which is fine, nor any appliance which will need a long scientific explanation at the end. You might argue we're kind of pushing the limits of that here. It's not chemical X that we don't know about. The scientist doesn't have to come forward this is my mind control device and that is what killed the person. We don't need that. But the explanation of the tap is a little bit long.
I can definitely sympathize with that. As I said, I don't disagree with the fact that this is kind of the least cleanly executed part of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. But I still don't think that dissuades my opinion from it being fair.
Sure.
I don't think you need to understand that, tap A was turned on, tap B was turned off, tap C was turned on.
Yeah.
To understand the puzzle, you just need to know the taps were complicated.
Yeah,
The stiff one only had a print on one side, and the other one was easy to turn on and off, right? With those three pieces of information, you have 90% of what you need to solve it,
Sure.
and I think that's fine.
Sure. I guess that's one of those things with murder mysteries where it's difficult to tell how many clues the audience member kind of needs to solve it, because there's a fine line between here is an important piece of information that you could keep in mind for the future, and here is the answer to the puzzle, right?
Absolutely.
If they had said, it's funny, I feel like I could turn off this tap without leaving any fingerprints, that would have given it away. So clearly Knox had gotten the idea of this, 3 taps puzzle before he'd thought about how to present that to the reader. That's the impression I get, at least.
I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that does sound fairly plausible.
Yeah.
And I think that, if anything, that might be the spawning point for the story, right?
Yeah.
You'll typically come into it with an idea and flesh it out from there. So maybe that was the first idea, but we kind of got carried away with these characters, much to the strength of the story, mind you. But then that kind of got left to the wayside a little bit.
Yeah. Which I think is actually fine because this is a murder mystery novel, but its main focus is as a like absurdist murder mystery novel. Like it's still
Absolutely.
clever, but the main draw, like when I tell people about this, when I tell you guys about this, this is a funny story, you know. This is one that you'll chuckle about on the way home, you know? Like the first couple of chapters, I was chuckling on nearly every other line. Like it's just so well written and it's just a fun time to read. This isn't, you know, this great big epic on the nature of man. It is in fact a story without a moral that we should have a fun time with.
Or maybe absurdism is a big piece of commentary on the nature of man.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Who am I to judge?
I did particularly love the beginning of the final chapter, just Pulteney going, not another mental perspective.
Yeah.
Like you could feel that line came from the heart.
Absolutely. That's definitely the joke. The joke is on the author. It's great.
I think right now at the end, Herds, if you had to rate the difficulty of this puzzle on a scale of stories with fishing poles out of 10, what would you rate it?
How many fishing poles out of 10 would I give? I feel like it's certainly higher up than the most murder mysteries, but it's not quite like the most difficult. I'd give it like a 7 or an 8, maybe an 8. You know? I feel like most people would struggle to figure everything out. You have some experience with this. Certainly someone who had never read a murder mystery before, I think might have some trouble. I would normally have given it maybe a 6.5 or a 7, but I feel like that tap puzzle kind of pushes a bit higher. I'd put it an 8. So it's not like impossible. But I think most people would be like, is it Brinkman or is it someone else? So they're going to pull the rug out from under us at the end, which they kind of do anyway, mind you.
Now, you've said that this isn't a story that beginners to murder mystery would be particularly able to solve very easily. Do you think it's a good beginner's story just for the genre, though?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a good time. It's not trying to, you know, construct any sort of arguments about the murder mystery genre. It's not doing anything crazy like that. It's just a good time. You could read this and just enjoy the characters, you know. See Pulteney and his goofiness, see the Miss Righto and her forthrightness, and enjoy Angela, you know, weaving her way through the scenes. And I don't think that any given scene is particularly complicated. The novel also does a good job of refreshing us almost constantly through the kind of witty banter between the different characters. I definitely think this is a good beginner story. I think you could have a really good time with it and just not worry about solving things. You know, give it your best shot because that's how they're designed. But like, I feel like you would be totally fine just giving it a go. And then maybe moving on to some of Knox's other novels.
Yeah, I think the other thing that particularly stood out to me in that regard was that it's an absurdist story, and we said in the first episode discussing the 3 taps that it felt very timeless in the way that it was written.
Yep.
I think that timelessness does start to deteriorate a bit towards the end, but I don't think that modern readers will feel out of their depth. And I think that that's something that has really lent my heart to this story. I had a really good time just enjoying it. Like, I basically breezed through it once and then was like, oh, right, I'm meant to be solving this. And then had to go back and reread the chapters over and over again to get it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think to some extent that's the way that murder mysteries should be, because the rereading of it and the discovering of how the puzzle was laid out before you without you even realizing it is one of the best parts of the genre. And this story does a fantastic job of laying it out in a way that you'll enjoy going back over. And that's what I'm really looking forward to doing.
Yeah. Looking forward to my 3rd read, technically. It's going to be good.
Well, thank you for joining us on Death of the Reader here on 2SER 107.3.
Wait. Flex.
What?
What novel are we doing next week?
Oh, right.
You're going to tell us that.
Next week.
It's your turn.
It is. Next week, Herds, I challenge you to The Floating Admiral by The Detection Club.
I accept.
You only have to contend with chapters 1 to 4 for now, Herds, but it's a tough cookie.
Sounds amazing. Let's do it.
See you then.